Introduction. Top 10 Major Catastrophes in the Common Era CE. Human civilization often imagines itself as stable, advancing and increasingly in control of its destiny, yet the Common Era tells a different story. One shaped not only by invention, culture, and progress, but by sudden shocks that have repeatedly shattered the world people thought they understood. Catastrophes have arrived from every direction, from beneath the ground, from the sky, from the smallest forms of life, and from humanity's own capacity for violence. Each event has left a mark not just on landscapes and populations, but on the structure of history itself. This series examines 10 defining moments when the familiar order collapsed and societies were forced to confront forces far beyond their control. These catastrophes were not isolated tragedies. They were turning points that redirected economies, reshaped borders, transformed cultures, and exposed the fragility of even the most confident civilizations. They reveal how deeply human life depends on systems that can fail in an instant, and how quickly stability can dissolve into chaos. But they also show something else: resilience. After every collapse came adaptation, rebuilding, and reinvention. The world that exists today is the product of these cycles of destruction and renewal. To understand these catastrophes is to understand the true shape of the Common Era, an age defined not only by what humanity has built, but by what it has survived. Part 1. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius. In the 1st century of our era, life around the Bay of Naples moved with a confidence that only long periods of stability can create. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum lived in a world shaped by trade, wealth, and routine. Markets opened at dawn, villas echoed with conversation, and the streets carried the noise of a thriving Roman society. Above them stood Mount Vesuvius, a mountain so familiar that it had become part of the background, a silent shape that no one questioned. It had been quiet for so long that entire generations grew up believing it was nothing more than a landmark. But deep beneath its calm exterior, the Earth was preparing a reminder that even the most advanced civilizations remain guests on a restless planet. For centuries, magma had been rising slowly through the crust, gathering pressure in chambers hidden far below the surface. Gases accumulated, cracks widened, and the mountain's internal structure strained under forces that humans could neither see nor imagine. There were signs, but they were subtle. Small tremors, springs drying up, animals behaving strangely. Yet in a world without modern science, these warnings blended into the noise of everyday life. People continued their routines, unaware that the ground beneath them was approaching a breaking point. When the eruption began, it did not announce itself with a dramatic explosion. It started with a strange heaviness in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that people could feel but not explain. Then the mountain opened. A column of ash and molten rock burst upward with unimaginable force, rising tens of kilometers into the sky. Daylight vanished. The sun disappeared behind a wall of darkness so thick that the world below was plunged into an unnatural night. Ash fell like snow, but heavier, hotter, deadlier. Roofs collapsed under its weight, streets filled with pumice. The air became thick with choking gases that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. Panic spread through the cities. Families tried to flee, carrying what little they could. Some sought shelter indoors, believing the danger would pass. Others ran toward the sea, hoping for rescue. But the world around them was changing faster than they could react. The eruption intensified, sending shockwaves through the region. Buildings shook. Fires ignited. The sky rumbled with the sound of a mountain tearing itself apart. Then came the pyroclastic flows, the most devastating phase of the disaster. These were not rivers of lava but avalanches of superheated gas. Ash and rock, moving faster than any person could run, they swept down the slopes of Vesuvius with the force of a collapsing sky, obliterating everything in their path. Temperatures soared high enough to kill instantly. Entire neighborhoods vanished in moments. Pompeii and Herculaneum were overwhelmed, not slowly, but in a single catastrophic wave of heat and ash. What makes this event unique is not only the scale of destruction but the way it preserved the world it destroyed. The ash sealed buildings, objects, and even human bodies with extraordinary detail. Food left on tables, tools dropped in the streets, frescoes on the walls. All were frozen in time. The final moments of an entire society were captured with such precision that nearly 2 millennia later, we can still see the expressions on the faces of those who lived through the catastrophe. It is as if time itself paused, leaving behind a message carved in ash. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius was more than a natural disaster. It was a confrontation between human confidence and planetary power. It revealed how fragile civilization truly is, how quickly stability can collapse, and how the familiar world can transform into something unrecognizable in a single day. It reminded us that the Earth is alive, that its forces operate on scales far beyond human understanding, and that every generation lives in the shadow of events it cannot predict or control. In the ruins of Pompeii, we do not just see tragedy, we see a warning carried across centuries, that beneath our cities, our routines, and our certainty, the planet continues to move, breathe, and change, indifferent to the stories we build upon it. Part 2. The Plague of Justinian. In the 6th century of our era, the Eastern Roman Empire stood as one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. Its capital, Constantinople, was a city of marble, trade, and ambition, a place where cultures met and empires were shaped. Under Emperor Justinian, the empire sought to reclaim lost territories, restore Roman glory, and build monuments that would outlast generations. It was a world that believed in its own strength, a world convinced that human order could tame chaos. But in the year 541, something invisible began to move across continents, carried by trade routes, ships, and the quiet rhythm of daily life. It was a force that cared nothing for borders, armies, or imperial dreams. It was the plague. The disease likely began far to the south, in regions where climate shifts had disrupted ecosystems and driven rodents into new territories. Fleas carrying a deadly bacterium found their way onto merchant ships, hidden in grain supplies that fed the empire. When those ships reached the harbors of Egypt and then Constantinople, they carried with them the seeds of a catastrophe that would reshape the world. At first, the signs were subtle. A few unexplained deaths, strange fevers, whispers of illness spreading through crowded districts. But within weeks, the plague erupted with terrifying speed. People collapsed in the streets. Entire households fell silent. Markets emptied. The city that had once been the beating heart of an empire became a place of fear. The symptoms were brutal. High fever, delirium, swollen lymph nodes that darkened and burst. Many died within days. Others lingered in agony. The disease did not discriminate. It struck the poor and the wealthy, soldiers and merchants, priests and officials. Even the emperor himself fell ill, surviving only by chance. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The city's infrastructure collapsed under the weight of death. Graves filled, mass pits were dug in some districts. The dead were left in houses because no one remained to carry them away. The smell of decay drifted through the streets, mixing with incense burned in desperate attempts to purify the air. As the plague spread beyond Constantinople, it moved across the empire like a shadow. Villages emptied, farms were abandoned, trade routes fell silent, entire regions lost half their population. The empire's economy fractured, armies weakened. Territories that Justinian had fought to reclaim slipped away again. The plague did not simply kill people, it dismantled the structures that held society together. It weakened the empire at a moment when it faced external threats, leaving it vulnerable to invasions and political upheaval. Historians believe that tens of millions died across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. What makes the Plague of Justinian more than a historical tragedy is the way it revealed the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. The Eastern Roman Empire had wealth, knowledge, infrastructure, and ambition, yet none of it could stop a microscopic organism carried by a flea. The plague exposed the limits of human control, showing that the greatest threats often come not from armies or rival nations, but from forces too small to see. It also reshaped the future. The weakened empire could no longer sustain its expansion. Political power shifted, borders changed. the balance of the Mediterranean world was altered for centuries. In the end, the Plague of Justinian stands as a reminder that civilization is always more vulnerable than it appears. It shows how quickly order can collapse, how silently disaster can spread, and how deeply a single event can alter the course of history. It teaches us that the world we build, no matter how advanced, remains intertwined with the natural forces that surround it. And it echoes across time with a message that is as relevant today as it was 15 centuries ago, that humanity's greatest challenges often arrive without warning, carried not by armies or storms, but by the smallest forms of life on Earth. Part 3. The Mongol Conquests. In the 13th century of our era, a new power emerged from the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a force that would redraw the map of the known world and leave behind a trail of destruction, on a scale humanity had rarely seen before. The Mongols began as scattered nomadic tribes, living in a harsh environment that demanded resilience, discipline, and adaptability. Under the leadership of a man who would become known as Genghis Khan, these tribes were united into a single war machine. What followed was not just a series of military campaigns, but a transformation of Eurasia driven by speed, fear, and relentless strategy. The Mongol armies were unlike anything settled civilizations had faced. They moved quickly, striking deep into enemy territory, with highly trained horse archers who could travel great distances in a short time. Their warfare was based on mobility, coordination, and psychological terror. Cities were given a choice: surrender and submit to Mongol rule, or resist and face total destruction. Many who resisted were wiped out. Entire populations were massacred, not only as punishment, but as a deliberate message to others. Stories of cities burned to the ground and inhabitants killed spread ahead of the Mongol advance, weakening the will to resist long before the armies arrived. From the steppes of Mongolia, the conquests expanded in all directions. The Mongols crushed powerful kingdoms in northern China, swept through Central Asia, and advanced into Persia and the Middle East. They destroyed cities that had stood for centuries, including great centers of culture and learning. The siege of Baghdad in the middle of the 13th century marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and dealt a devastating blow to the Islamic Golden Age. Libraries, observatories, and institutions that had preserved knowledge for generations were burned or looted. The House of Wisdom, one of the most important repositories of scientific and philosophical texts in the world, was destroyed. In a matter of days, centuries of accumulated knowledge were lost. The impact was not limited to the Islamic world. The Mongols pushed westward into Eastern Europe, reaching as far as Hungary and Poland. Towns and villages were razed, populations displaced or killed. In some regions, the demographic impact was so severe that it took generations for populations to recover. Estimates of the total number of deaths caused directly or indirectly by the Mongol conquests vary widely, but many historians agree that tens of millions of people may have died as a result of warfare, massacres, famine, and disease triggered by the upheaval. For those who lived through it, the Mongol advance must have felt like the collapse of the world they knew. Yet the story of the Mongol conquests is not only one of destruction. Once territories were subdued, the Mongols often allowed local rulers to remain in place as long as they paid tribute and accepted Mongol authority. They established a vast network of communication and trade routes across their empire, connecting east and west in ways that had never existed before. The so-called Silk Road flourished under their protection, allowing merchants, travelers, and ideas to move across continents with relative safety. Technologies, religions, and knowledge spread between cultures that had previously been isolated from one another. In this sense, the Mongol Empire acted as both a destroyer and a connector, tearing down old structures while unintentionally creating new links between distant societies. But for many regions, the cost was overwhelming. Cities that refused to surrender were annihilated. Irrigation systems were damaged or abandoned, leading to long-term agricultural decline in some areas. Entire regions were depopulated. The psychological impact was immense. Chroniclers of the time described the Mongols as a scourge, a punishment, a force beyond human comprehension. To them, it seemed as if an unstoppable storm had swept across the world, indifferent to culture, faith, or history. The Mongol conquests remind us that human civilization is not only shaped by gradual change, but also by sudden, violent shocks. They show how a single, highly organized force can destabilize entire continents, collapse empires, and erase centuries of development in a matter of decades. They also reveal a paradox: that the same empire responsible for some of the deadliest campaigns in history also helped create the conditions for increased global contact and exchange. In the end, the Mongol Empire itself fragmented and faded, as all empires eventually do, but the scars it left on the landscape, the demographic shifts it caused, and the cultural transformations it set in motion continued to shape the world long after its armies stopped riding. The story of the Mongol conquests is not just a chapter in medieval history. It is a reminder of how quickly power can rise, how brutally it can be used, and how deeply its consequences can echo through time. Part 4. The Black Death. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe, Asia, and North Africa were connected by trade routes that carried goods, ideas, and cultures across continents. These routes formed the backbone of a growing global economy, linking distant cities in a network of exchange that had never been so active. But along these same routes, something else was moving. Something small, silent, and deadly. It began in Central Asia, where environmental pressures and shifting ecosystems pushed rodent populations into closer contact with human settlements. Fleas carrying a bacterium that had existed for centuries found new hosts, new environments, and new opportunities to spread. When merchants and caravans began their long journeys westward, they unknowingly carried with them the seeds of a catastrophe that would reshape the world. By the time the disease reached the Crimean ports, it had already killed thousands across the steppes. From there, it boarded ships bound for the Mediterranean, hidden in the fur of rats that thrived in the dark corners of cargo holds. When those ships arrived in cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, Genoa, and Venice, the plague began to spread with terrifying speed. People fell ill suddenly, with high fever, chills, vomiting, and the painful swelling of lymph nodes that turned black as they filled with infection. Many died within days. Others lingered in agony. Entire households collapsed. Streets emptied. Markets closed. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. The scale of the disaster was unlike anything Europe had experienced. In some cities, half the population died within a few months. In others, entire neighborhoods were abandoned as survivors fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the invisible threat. But the plague did not respect distance. It followed trade routes, river paths, and human movement, reaching even remote villages that had little contact with the outside world. Chroniclers of the time described scenes of despair, bodies left in homes because no one remained to bury them, carts filled with the dead moving through silent streets, priests unable to keep up with the demand for last rites. The social fabric of entire regions began to unravel. The psychological impact was immense. People searched for explanations in religion, superstition, and fear. Some believed the plague was divine punishment. Others blamed outsiders, leading to violence and persecution. Medical knowledge of the time was limited, and treatments were ineffective. The disease seemed unstoppable, striking without pattern or mercy. In many places, normal life simply ceased. Fields went untilled. Workshops closed. Trade halted. The rhythms that had defined medieval society broke down under the weight of death, yet the Black Death did more than kill. It transformed. The massive loss of life created labor shortages that shifted economic power toward workers and peasants. Feudal structures weakened. Wages rose. Land ownership changed hands. Entire political systems were forced to adapt. In some regions, the plague accelerated the decline of old institutions and paved the way for new forms of governance. Cultural attitudes shifted as well. Art, literature, and philosophy began to reflect a deeper awareness of mortality, fragility, and the unpredictability of life. The foundations of the Renaissance were shaped, in part, by the world the plague left behind. The demographic impact was staggering. Historians estimate that tens of millions died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. making the Black Death one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Some regions lost more than 2/3 of their population. Recovery took generations. Entire villages disappeared from maps. Forests reclaimed farmland. The landscape itself changed as human activity declined. The plague did not simply pass through, it carved itself into the memory of civilizations. What makes the Black Death so significant is not only its scale, but the way it exposed the vulnerability of interconnected societies. The same trade networks that brought prosperity also carried danger. The same mobility that linked cultures also spread disease. The plague revealed how deeply human life depends on systems that can collapse in an instant. It showed that even the most established societies can be shaken to their core by forces they cannot see or control. In the end, the Black Death stands as one of the defining catastrophes of the Common Era. It reshaped economies, altered political structures, transformed culture, and left a mark on human history that remains visible today. It is a reminder that progress and vulnerability often grow together, and that the world we build is always more fragile than it appears. Part 5. The collapse of indigenous civilizations in the Americas. In the 16th century of our era, the continents we now call the Americas were home to millions of people and to civilizations that had developed independently for thousands of years. The Aztec Empire in central Mexico, the Inca Empire in the Andes, and countless other cultures across North and South America had built cities, agricultural systems, trade networks, and social structures that were as complex and sophisticated as those found anywhere else in the world. Their histories stretched back through centuries of innovation, adaptation, and cultural growth. But when European explorers and conquerors arrived, they brought with them something far more devastating than weapons or ambition. They brought diseases that the indigenous populations had never encountered, and for which they had no immunity. The first waves of illness began almost immediately after contact. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens spread through communities with terrifying speed. These diseases had circulated in Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries, shaping immune systems and creating partial resistance among those populations. But in the Americas, the immune landscape was entirely different. The people had no biological defenses against these infections. As a result, the mortality rates were catastrophic. In some regions, entire villages were wiped out within weeks. In others, the population declined so rapidly that social structures collapsed before anyone could understand what was happening. The scale of the demographic collapse is difficult to comprehend. Historians estimate that tens of millions of indigenous people died within a few generations of European arrival. In some areas, more than 9 out of 10 inhabitants perished. The impact was not limited to the great empires. Small communities, nomadic groups, agricultural societies, and coastal settlements all suffered devastating losses. The diseases spread faster than the Europeans themselves, moving along trade routes and through networks of communication that had existed long before contact. In many places, epidemics reached indigenous populations who had never seen a European face. The collapse was not the result of a single event, but of repeated waves of infection that struck again and again, each one weakening societies already struggling to recover. The consequences were profound. The Aztec Empire, weakened by smallpox, fell to Spanish forces who would have faced far greater resistance under normal circumstances. The Inca Empire, already destabilized by civil war, was devastated by epidemics that killed leaders, generals, and entire communities. Across the continents, political systems fractured, agricultural production declined. Religious and cultural traditions were disrupted as elders and knowledge keepers died in large numbers. The social fabric that had held these civilizations together for centuries began to unravel. European colonization accelerated the collapse. Conquest, forced labor, displacement, and violence compounded the effects of disease. Entire regions were depopulated, allowing colonizers to claim land with little resistance. The demographic vacuum reshaped the Americas, altering ecosystems, economies, and cultural landscapes. Forests grew where fields had once been cultivated. Cities were abandoned. Trade networks dissolved. The world that had existed before contact was transformed beyond recognition. Yet the story of this catastrophe is not only one of loss. Indigenous cultures adapted, resisted, and survived in ways that continue to shape the modern Americas. Languages, traditions, agricultural practices, and spiritual beliefs endured despite the overwhelming pressures of colonization and disease. The resilience of indigenous peoples is a testament to the strength of their cultures and the depth of their connection to the land. But the scale of the tragedy remains one of the greatest in human history, a reminder of how fragile societies can be when confronted with forces they cannot see or understand. The collapse of indigenous civilizations in the Americas stands as a stark example of how interconnected the world had become, even in an age before global communication. It shows how the movement of people across continents can bring not only exchange and discovery, but also devastation. It reveals the unintended consequences of exploration and the profound impact of biological encounters between populations separated for millennia, and it underscores a truth that echoes through history, that the greatest transformations often come not from battles or conquests, but from the smallest forms of life carried silently across oceans. In the end, this catastrophe reshaped the demographic, cultural, and political landscape of the Americas forever. It marked the beginning of a new era, one defined by colonization, resistance, adaptation, and survival, and it remains one of the most significant turning points in the story of human civilization. Part 6. The Great Lisbon Earthquake and Tsunami. In the middle of the 18th century, Lisbon was one of the most important cities in Europe, a thriving capital of a global empire that stretched across continents. It was a center of trade, culture, and political power, filled with grand churches, bustling markets, and ships arriving daily from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. On the morning of the first day of November in the year 1755, the city was preparing for All Saints' Day, one of the most significant religious celebrations of the year. Churches were crowded, candles burned in every chapel, and thousands of people gathered for morning mass. No one imagined that within a few hours, the city would be reduced to ruins and its population devastated by one of the most powerful natural disasters in recorded European history. Shortly after 9 in the morning, the ground began to shake. At first, it was a tremor, the kind that might rattle windows or shift furniture. But within seconds, the shaking intensified into a violent convulsion that tore buildings apart. The earthquake lasted for several minutes, an eternity for those trapped inside collapsing structures. Entire neighborhoods crumbled. Churches filled with worshippers collapsed, burying hundreds beneath stone and timber. The royal palace, libraries, hospitals, and countless homes were destroyed. The shaking was so intense that fissures opened in the streets, some wide enough to swallow people whole. Survivors described the sound as a roar rising from beneath the earth, a deep and terrifying reminder of forces far beyond human control. But the earthquake was only the beginning. As people fled toward the waterfront, seeking open space and safety from falling debris, the sea suddenly receded. Ships anchored in the harbor were left stranded on the exposed seabed. Moments later, a massive wall of water surged toward the city. The tsunami swept through the lower districts of Lisbon with overwhelming force, carrying away people, animals, debris, and entire sections of the port. Those who had survived the collapse of buildings were caught in the flood, dragged into the swirling water, or crushed by floating wreckage. The wave destroyed everything in its path, leaving behind a landscape of devastation. Fires soon followed. Candles lit for the religious holiday toppled during the earthquake, igniting wooden structures and spreading flames across the ruined city, with water supplies disrupted and streets blocked by debris. The fires burned uncontrollably for days. The combination of earthquake, tsunami, and fire created a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Tens of thousands died, though exact numbers remain uncertain. The destruction was so extensive that Lisbon, once one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, was left in ruins. The impact of the disaster extended far beyond the physical destruction. The Lisbon earthquake shook the intellectual and philosophical foundations of Europe, at a time when the Enlightenment was reshaping ideas about science, reason, and the natural world. The catastrophe raised profound questions about the nature of suffering, divine will, and the limits of human understanding. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Rousseau debated its meaning, using the event to challenge traditional beliefs and explore new ideas about the relationship between humanity and nature. The disaster became a symbol of the unpredictability of the world, a reminder that even the most advanced societies remain vulnerable to forces they cannot control. The political consequences were also significant. The Portuguese government faced the enormous task of rebuilding the capital, restoring order, and preventing social collapse. Under the leadership of the Marquis of Pombal, reconstruction began almost immediately. He implemented strict measures to maintain stability, organized the removal of bodies to prevent disease, and oversaw the planning of a new city layout designed to withstand future earthquakes. The rebuilt Lisbon became one of the first European cities to incorporate modern seismic-resistant architecture, a legacy of the disaster that continues to influence urban planning. Economically, the earthquake weakened Portugal's global position. Trade networks were disrupted, colonial administration was strained, and the cost of reconstruction placed a heavy burden on the state. The disaster accelerated shifts in European power dynamics, contributing to the rise of other nations while Portugal struggled to recover. The psychological impact on the population was immense. Survivors carried the memory of the event for the rest of their lives, and the trauma shaped cultural expressions, religious practices, and collective identity for generations. The Great Lisbon earthquake stands as one of the most significant natural disasters in the history of the Common Era. It revealed the fragility of human structures, both physical and philosophical. It demonstrated how quickly a thriving civilization can be brought to its knees by forces beneath the earth and beyond the horizon. And it left behind a legacy of scientific inquiry, architectural innovation, and cultural reflection that continues to influence the modern world. The disaster remains a powerful reminder that even the most confident societies live at the mercy of a planet that can change without warning, reshaping history in a single morning. Part 7. The Eruption of Mount Tambora. In the early 19th century, the world was entering a period of rapid change. Empires were expanding, scientific ideas were spreading, and global trade was connecting distant regions more closely than ever before. Yet beneath the surface of this growing interconnectedness, the Earth itself was preparing a reminder of its power. On the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, stood Mount Tambora, a volcano that had been quiet for centuries. Local communities lived on its fertile slopes, unaware that deep within the mountain, magma was rising and pressure was building. The signs of unrest began slowly: small tremors, distant rumbles, plumes of smoke drifting from the summit. But in the year 1815, the mountain erupted with a force unmatched in recorded human history. The first major explosion occurred in early April, sending ash high into the atmosphere and shaking the surrounding islands. But the true catastrophe came a few days later, when Tambora unleashed a series of massive eruptions that tore apart the mountain's peak and released an enormous volume of ash, gas, and molten rock. The sound of the explosion was heard more than 1,000 kilometers away, described by witnesses as resembling distant cannon fire or the roar of an immense storm. Entire villages on the island were obliterated instantly. Pyroclastic flows swept down the slopes, incinerating everything in their path. Ash fell so heavily that it turned day into night across large regions of Southeast Asia. The immediate human toll was devastating. Tens of thousands died on Sumbawa and neighboring islands, either from the eruption itself or from the famine and disease that followed. Crops were destroyed. water sources contaminated, and entire communities displaced. But the true scale of the disaster extended far beyond Indonesia. The eruption injected vast quantities of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where they formed a reflective layer that spread around the globe. This veil of particles reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface, triggering a dramatic and prolonged shift in global climate. The year that followed became known as the Year Without a Summer. Across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, temperatures dropped sharply. Snow fell in June, frost struck in July, crops failed on a massive scale. Farmers watched helplessly as fields that should have been green with growth remained barren or were destroyed by sudden cold. Food shortages spread, leading to hunger, economic turmoil, and social unrest. In some regions, people were forced to eat whatever they could find: roots, bark, even the remains of animals that had died from starvation. The global agricultural collapse triggered one of the worst famines of the 19th century. The climate anomalies had far-reaching consequences. In Europe, the cold and darkness inspired new artistic and literary movements. During a particularly bleak summer in Switzerland, a group of writers confined indoors by relentless storms began telling stories to pass the time. Among them was Mary Shelley, who conceived the idea for her novel Frankenstein, a work that would become a cornerstone of modern literature. In North America, the failed harvests contributed to mass migration as families abandoned their homes in search of more stable conditions. The eruption also influenced scientific understanding of climate, prompting early studies into the relationship between volcanic activity and atmospheric change. Economically, the effects were severe. Grain prices soared. Governments struggled to maintain order. Trade networks were disrupted as shortages spread from region to region. The crisis exposed the vulnerability of global food systems, revealing how a single geological event could destabilize societies thousands of kilometers away. It also highlighted the interconnectedness of the world, showing that local disasters could have global consequences in an increasingly linked human landscape. Yet the eruption of Tambora was not only a story of destruction. It also marked a turning point in the scientific study of volcanoes and climate. Observers around the world recorded unusual weather patterns, strange sunsets, and persistent atmospheric haze. These observations laid the groundwork for future research into volcanic aerosols and their impact on global temperatures. The event became a case study in how natural forces can shape human history, influencing everything from migration patterns to cultural expression. The legacy of Tambora is a reminder that the Earth operates on scales far beyond human planning. It shows how a single eruption can alter the climate, disrupt economies, and reshape societies. It reveals the delicate balance between human civilization and the natural systems that sustain it, and it underscores a truth that echoes through every major catastrophe: that the world we build is always vulnerable to the forces beneath our feet and above our heads. In the end, the eruption of Mount Tambora stands as one of the most powerful volcanic events in the history of the Common Era. Its impact was global, its consequences profound, and its lessons enduring. It remains a testament to the immense power of the planet, and a reminder that even in an age of growing knowledge and expanding empires, humanity remains deeply connected to and dependent on the natural world. Part 8. The First World War. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe stood at the height of its global influence. Empires stretched across continents, industrial power was growing rapidly, and scientific progress was reshaping the way people understood the world. Cities expanded, railways connected distant regions, and new technologies promised a future of prosperity and stability. Yet beneath this surface of confidence lay deep political tensions, rival alliances, and unresolved conflicts that had been building for decades. Nationalism, imperial competition, and military expansion created a fragile balance that could be shattered by a single event. In the summer of 1914, that event arrived. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the spark, but the explosion that followed was the result of long-standing structural pressures. Within weeks, the major powers of Europe were drawn into a conflict that none of them had fully anticipated. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain mobilized millions of soldiers, believing the war would be short and decisive. Instead, it became a prolonged and devastating struggle that transformed the continent into a landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and industrialized death. The nature of warfare changed dramatically. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas tanks, and aircraft introduced new forms of destruction. Battles that once lasted days now stretched into months, with front lines barely moving despite enormous casualties. The Western Front became a symbol of this new reality, a static, muddy, shell-scarred world where soldiers lived in trenches under constant threat of bombardment, disease, and sudden attack. The scale of suffering was immense. Entire units were wiped out in minutes. Towns and villages were reduced to rubble. The land itself was torn apart by continuous shelling, leaving behind a barren and lifeless terrain. The Eastern Front was more fluid but no less brutal. Armies clashed across vast distances, and millions of civilians were caught in the path of advancing and retreating forces. Famine, displacement, and disease spread as infrastructure collapsed. The Ottoman Empire, drawn into the conflict, fought on multiple fronts while also carrying out the Armenian genocide, one of the darkest chapters of the war. In the Middle East, new political boundaries were drawn through conflict and negotiation, shaping the region's future for generations. The war extended far beyond Europe. Colonial troops from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were drawn into the conflict, fighting in battles far from their homelands. The global nature of the war disrupted trade, strained economies, and reshaped international relations. Naval blockades caused shortages of food and essential goods. Submarine warfare threatened civilian ships, bringing the conflict to the world's oceans. The entry of the United States in 1917 shifted the balance of power, providing fresh troops and resources to the exhausted Allied forces. On the home front, societies were transformed. Governments expanded their control over industry, transportation, and communication. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles previously reserved for men. Propaganda campaigns shaped public opinion, while censorship limited access to information. Rationing, inflation, and the constant fear of loss became part of daily life. The psychological toll was immense, as families waited for news from the front, often receiving only silence or a brief official notice of death. By the time the war ended in 1918, the world had changed irreversibly. Millions were dead, millions more wounded, and entire generations were marked by trauma. Empires collapsed. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires all fell, giving rise to new nations and political movements. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties on Germany, sowing resentment that would later contribute to the rise of extremism. The map of Europe was redrawn, but the peace that followed was fragile and incomplete. The First World War was not only a military conflict, it was a turning point in human history. It revealed the destructive potential of modern technology, exposed the limits of political leadership, and shattered the illusion that progress alone could guarantee stability. It showed how interconnected the world had become, and how quickly local tensions could escalate into global catastrophe. It also left behind a legacy of cultural and intellectual transformation. Art, literature, and philosophy shifted toward themes of disillusionment, existential questioning, and the search for meaning in a world that had witnessed unprecedented destruction. In the end, the First World War stands as one of the most significant catastrophes of the Common Era. It reshaped borders, toppled empires, transformed societies, and set the stage for future conflicts. It remains a reminder of how fragile peace can be, how quickly nations can descend into violence, and how deeply the consequences of war can echo through generations. The world that emerged from the conflict was profoundly different from the one that entered it, marked forever by the memory of a war that was meant to end all wars, but instead became the beginning of a new and turbulent century. Part 9. The Spanish flu pandemic. At the end of the First World War, the world was exhausted. Nations were shattered, economies strained, and millions of soldiers were returning home from the front lines carrying memories of violence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Cities were crowded with refugees, hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded veterans, and governments were struggling to rebuild societies that had been pushed to the brink. It was in this fragile moment, when humanity believed the worst was finally over, that a new and invisible threat emerged. It was a virus unlike anything modern medicine had ever encountered, a strain of influenza so aggressive and so contagious that it would kill more people in 2 years than the war had killed in 4. The first cases appeared in the spring of 1918. At first, the illness seemed ordinary, similar to seasonal flu outbreaks that occurred every year. But within weeks, doctors noticed something unusual. The virus spread with extraordinary speed, moving through military camps, factories and cities with a momentum that defied containment. Soldiers traveling between continents carried it across oceans. Civilians packed into trains and trams unknowingly passed it to strangers. The world's growing transportation networks, already strained by war, became channels for a pandemic that would reach every inhabited continent. The symptoms were severe. High fever, intense fatigue, coughing, and body aches were common, but in many cases the disease progressed rapidly into pneumonia. Some patients turned blue from lack of oxygen. Others bled from the nose or mouth. Many died within days of showing symptoms. What made the Spanish flu particularly shocking was its impact on young adults. Unlike most influenza strains, which tend to be most dangerous to the very young and the elderly, this virus struck hardest at people in their 20s and 30s, the same generation that had already suffered enormous losses in the war. Entire families were devastated. Communities lost teachers, workers, parents, and soldiers in a matter of weeks. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses, already exhausted from years of treating war injuries, struggled to cope with the influx of patients. Medical supplies ran out. Makeshift wards were set up in schools, churches, and community halls. In many places, there were not enough coffins or grave diggers to keep up with the number of deaths. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Public gatherings were banned. Schools and theaters closed. Streets that had once been filled with the noise of daily life fell silent as people isolated themselves in fear of infection. Governments faced difficult decisions. Some tried to suppress information about the outbreak, fearing that public knowledge of the pandemic would weaken morale or disrupt wartime efforts. Others issued warnings, but their messages were often inconsistent or too late. The name Spanish flu emerged not because the virus originated in Spain, but because Spain, being neutral during the war, did not censor its newspapers. As a result, Spanish reports of the outbreak were among the first widely circulated, creating the false impression that the country was the source of the pandemic. The virus came in waves. The second wave, in the autumn of 1918, was far deadlier than the first. Cities that had relaxed restrictions were hit again with even greater force. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. In some regions, essential services collapsed as workers fell ill. Food shortages occurred. Transportation slowed. The psychological toll was immense, as people realized that the pandemic was not a brief crisis, but a prolonged and unpredictable threat. By the time the pandemic subsided in 1920, it had killed tens of millions of people worldwide. Estimates vary, but many historians believe that more than 50 million may have died, making it one of the deadliest events in human history. The demographic impact was profound. Life expectancy dropped sharply in many countries. Families were left without parents, children, or siblings. The social and economic consequences lasted for decades, yet the Spanish flu also transformed medicine and public health. It exposed the limitations of early 20th century medical knowledge and highlighted the need for better disease surveillance, improved sanitation, and coordinated international response systems. It accelerated research into virology, epidemiology, and vaccines. It also reshaped public attitudes toward health, hygiene, and government responsibility during crises. The The pandemic revealed how vulnerable the world had become to global threats. The same transportation networks that connected nations also allowed the virus to spread rapidly. The same urban density that fueled economic growth also created ideal conditions for transmission. The Spanish flu demonstrated that even in an age of scientific progress, humanity remained deeply exposed to forces it could not fully control. In the end, the Spanish flu pandemic stands as one of the defining catastrophes of the Common Era. It reshaped societies, transformed medicine, and left a legacy of caution that continues to influence public health policy today. It is a reminder that the greatest dangers often arrive quietly, spreading through the ordinary rhythms of life, and that the world's interconnectedness, while a source of strength, can also amplify the reach of disaster. Part 10. The Second World War. In the middle of the 20th century, the world entered a conflict so vast and destructive that it reshaped the course of human history. The Second World War did not begin suddenly. It emerged from the unresolved tensions of the First World War, from economic collapse, political extremism, and the rise of regimes built on aggression and ideology. Across Europe and Asia, nations were rearming, alliances were shifting, and leaders were preparing for confrontation. The global order was fragile, and beneath the surface of diplomacy and negotiation, the foundations of peace were already cracking. When the war finally erupted in the year 1939, it unleashed a level of violence and devastation that no previous generation had witnessed. The conflict began with the invasion of Poland, a swift and brutal campaign that demonstrated the effectiveness of modern mechanized warfare. Tanks, aircraft, and coordinated ground assaults overwhelmed defenses in a matter of weeks. As Germany expanded its control across Europe, other nations were drawn into the conflict. France fell. Britain stood alone against the threat of invasion. The skies above London and other cities became battlegrounds as the Blitz rained destruction on civilian populations. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, entire communities were uprooted as armies advanced and retreated across vast territories. The war was not confined to soldiers on the front lines. It reached into homes, schools, and workplaces, turning ordinary life into a struggle for survival. In Asia, the conflict had begun earlier, with Japan's expansion into China and the Pacific. Cities such as Nanjing suffered atrocities that shocked the world. As Japan sought to extend its influence across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, the region became another major theater of war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in the year 1941 brought the United States into the conflict, transforming the war into a truly global struggle. Battles raged across oceans, jungles, deserts, and frozen landscapes. Millions of soldiers fought in conditions that tested the limits of endurance, while civilians faced bombings, occupation, famine, and forced labor. The war also revealed the darkest capacities of human behavior. Under the Nazi regime, the systematic persecution and extermination of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other targeted groups became one of the most horrific crimes in history. The Holocaust, carried out through ghettos, mass shootings, and extermination camps, resulted in the deaths of millions. The scale and organization of this genocide shocked the world and left a permanent scar on human conscience. It demonstrated how ideology, hatred, and state power could combine to produce atrocities on an industrial scale. As the war progressed, the balance of power shifted. The Soviet Union, after suffering immense losses during the German invasion, pushed back with massive offensives that reclaimed territory and eventually drove German forces toward Berlin. In the Pacific, the United States and its allies fought a series of brutal island-hopping campaigns, gradually weakening Japan's ability to wage war. The conflict reached its final phase in the year 1945, when Germany surrendered after the fall of Berlin, and Japan capitulated following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombings introduced the world to the destructive potential of nuclear weapons, marking the beginning of a new and dangerous era. The human cost of the Second World War was staggering. Tens of millions of people died, including soldiers, civilians, prisoners of war, and victims of genocide. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. Economies collapsed. Families were torn apart. The psychological trauma endured by survivors lasted for decades. The war reshaped borders, toppled governments, and gave rise to new global powers. The United Nations was established in an attempt to prevent future conflicts of similar scale. The geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically, setting the stage for the Cold War, a prolonged period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that would define the second half of the 20th century. Yet the war also accelerated technological and scientific advancements. Radar, jet engines, antibiotics, rocketry, and early computing systems emerged from wartime research. These innovations would later transform civilian life, influencing everything from medicine to transportation. The war also prompted new discussions about human rights, international law, and the responsibilities of nations toward their citizens and the global community. The Nuremberg trials established legal precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity, shaping the future of international justice. The Second World War remains one of the most significant catastrophes of the Common Era. It demonstrated the destructive potential of modern industrial societies, the dangers of unchecked ideology, and the fragility of global peace. It revealed both the worst and the best of humanity: cruelty and courage, hatred and resilience, destruction and rebuilding. The world that emerged from the conflict was profoundly different from the one that entered it, shaped by lessons that continue to influence international relations, political systems, and cultural memory. In the end, the war stands as a reminder of the consequences of division, extremism, and aggression. It shows how quickly nations can descend into chaos, how deeply violence can reshape societies, and how essential it is to preserve the fragile structures that maintain peace. The Second World War is not only a historical event, it is a warning carried forward through generations, urging humanity to remember the cost of forgetting its own past. Conclusion: the world shaped by catastrophe. Across 2 millennia of the Common Era, humanity has risen, fallen, adapted, and rebuilt in the shadow of forces far greater than itself. These 10 catastrophes remind us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a fragile balance constantly tested by nature, disease, conflict, and the unpredictable movements of the world around us. Each disaster reshaped societies, redirected cultures, and exposed the limits of human certainty, yet each one also revealed resilience, the ability of people to endure, to learn, and to rebuild even when the familiar world has collapsed. Thank you for listening, and for taking this journey through the defining shocks of our era. If this series gave you something to think about, consider pressing like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.